You are listening to The Material Revolution, a podcast dedicated to building a better understanding of and relationship to textiles, fibers, and resources. I am your host, Catherine Susi, and I'm sitting down with artists, designers, educators, scientists, and creative thinkers from around the globe about their specialized knowledge and experience in working with fibers, processes, techniques, and technologies with the intention to create awareness, inspire knowledge, address responsible practices, encourage creativity, and to build a material community. So I welcome you to tune in and listen to those who are contributing towards change and a material revolution. Before we dive into today's interview and content, you can find us at www.thematerialrevolution.com. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at The Material Revolution. And to view some of our video interviews, hop on over to our YouTube channel. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of The Material Revolution. This week, my interview is with artist Lisa Simpson, or for some, you may know her from her research and performances as Agente Costura. As technology has progressed and tools and machineries have evolved, the obsolescence of some types of machinery and tools are a result of design evolution. But they have eliminated a certain amount of the human hand, resulting in the automation of materials and textiles. The fragments of the past associated with these artifacts, along with its tools, are kept alive by artists and craftspeople and their practices who have discovered and reimagined their use and raison d'etre, allowing for these tools to be explored beyond their traditional use and reuse. It gives them the opportunity to develop creative research and practices in order to produce from this place of pleasure and value by acknowledging their history, one that is either retired from service or one that has been not acknowledged at all for their service. It gives this opportunity for the maker to collaborate. And it's through this process that the maker has the ability to transform this relationship. The emergent and unexpected outcomes that can come from this kind of space allows for a certain amount of reflection to occur, one that's based on reciprocity, understanding our human connection and relationship to materials and processes, but also allowing for us to experience the development of our skill set and knowledges of these tools and resources from a space of pleasure in order to create meaning. What is this meaning that is produced, you ask? Well, it is the well-being of the maker and the relationship to the materials and processes used to achieve an understanding of balance in this world, which is very much littered with chaos and disorder. That is what I suggest that we need to examine and consider, in particular with my interview with Lisa. We do need to challenge our perception and understanding of the valuable role that the discarded and obsolete serves as a tool for research and as a creative resource, along with our understanding of how these tools and materials perform physically, conceptually, and philosophically. It is from here we can create alternate systems and pathways towards solutions that can really lead us into developing a community that's born out of resourcefulness and creativity, a community that fosters a value system that honors our materials and resources, otherwise known as Mother Nature, and its contributions by the human hand used in the process. My guest, Lisa Simpson, is an artist who performs with this sewing machine as a musical instrument. By day, she tackles unwanted clothing, pins them down, and cuts them up, transforming them into new wearable shapes and forms. Her use and transformation of post-consumer waste gives her the ability to question contemporary consumption habits, bringing forth a discussion around the sustainability of the fashion industry. However, by night, Lisa's singer joins her fellow musicians as she sews to the beat of the music, improvising on clothing based on rhythm and sound. The prepared sewing machine is amplified to become a musical instrument, and layers of sound are looped as layers of fabric are stitched together, creating a dreamlike soundscape enhanced by self-built wearable oscillators and feedback machines. Lisa has a bachelor's and master's degree in visual arts and is currently enrolled in the Art and Context program at the Universität der Kunst Berlin. She has performed extensively on an international level, including the Goethe Institute in Jakarta, at the Vancouver Art Gallery, at various institutions in Berlin and Germany, Amsterdam, Brazil, among many others. Now, I do want to mention that for this episode, Lisa performed live from her studio with her sewing machine and with some of her self-built musical tools. My interview begins with this performance, which is a soundscape of her transforming a garment in the studio, which is around 15 minutes before our official interview begins. And although this interview can be experienced from an auditory manner, I do suggest that if you're curious, do visit our YouTube channel, because rather than using typical Zoom video footage to capture our time together, a special video of Lisa's performance of her process was patchworked together by the artist for you to all have a bit more of an intimate experience with her practice in her studio. So now I invite you to settle in, grab your favorite cup of tea, and spend the next hour and a half immersed in an artist's world who is motivated to inspire people to sew.
My name is Lisa Simpson. I am calling from the Agente Costura universe here on the Emserstraße in Berlin, my studio space.
Oh, fantastic, Lisa. And I want to say, so good to see you again. It's been a few years since we've actually seen each other in the flesh, in person, but we're much closer now than we were in the past, now that I'm in London and you are in Berlin. And thank you for that performance. I just want to mention for the audience listening to this, that this episode I think is quite special in that there is the audio version, but it's important, I think, that people go over to the YouTube channel, your performance and this interview. I do want to say that this is a great opportunity to visually experience everything that it is that you do as an artist and designer. I think this is a great way for me to sort of establish a little bit about what you do for our audience before we get into some of the questions that I have for you. And I want to say that you are an interdisciplinary artist and designer and a performer. There's many different labels that I'm sure that have been applied to you. And I know that you have a definitive identity in what you do as an artist. And it's that you also have this really unique approach, this hybrid approach to your practice that has been, I want to say, your expertise has developed as a result of working with post-consumer waste and waste textiles. But not just that, you have taken this process of creative use or reuse, or in some cases, the term upcycling is used, but you negotiate this space between not just the materials and tools that you work with, but you bring voice to different elements and different structures that are used that's inherent in the performance of materials and textiles and the tools that are associated in the making of clothing. And you completely bring this alternative approach and the method of upcycling to a whole other level, which is important because I think when it comes to the conversation of sustainability, textiles and clothing, there is a very linear approach. And I think what you bring forth is a acknowledgement of not just the materials and tools and processes that are often considered invisible. You bring this sense of honor and embodiment. The way that you animate the tools and materials that you work with allows for you to address certain aspects of your practice, which are near and dear to your heart. So things from gender equality to labor issues, obviously sustainability, and forms of craftivism that allows for you to transform not just our understanding of how we experience our clothing and our materials, but also in how we understand what creative possibilities exist in working with waste materials and textiles as a whole. I think this is a perfect segue into my first question for you is, who is Agente Costura?
Start with the big question.
Yeah.
Agente Costura is a performance art project where I use the sewing machine as a musical instrument. So it's the bringing together of textiles and sound, using as a starting point post-consumer waste and the repurposing of materials. Some of the things that you mentioned, actually the word that kind of stood out for me from what you just said is this idea of animating. And for me, Agente Costura is like this mixture of putting things on, dressing up, kind of animating yourself as something that's political, but that's also social, but that's also everything that we wear can say so much. And I think that's kind of the starting point of my practice. And then going into music and going into reusing textiles, turning things into instruments. Agente Costura is myself, but it's the space that I create. And it's the invitation for other people to come into the space and play with me, try things out, whether it's cutting up clothing or if trying out crazy instruments. Yeah, it's kind of building this animated universe in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Comes from a very tactile place in terms of, always working with textiles and building things, and very sound oriented. So I guess those would be maybe the two main things is the tactile textiles and the sound element.
Mm-hmm. I want to say for our audience, can you introduce some of the musical tools and textiles that you've developed? Can we take a look at what you were essentially assembling in the video that we just captured?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I can start with maybe what I'm...
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
I call it the Madonna hat because there's a microphone.
Yeah, it's perfect. Yeah.
A shoehorn that turns into the headpiece, and there's some electronics here that make the microphone work. This thing is the monster synthesizer. So
it's in the shape of a handbag.
It's a very vintage handbag
that you've converted into a
synthesizer.
That's fantastic.
So I love handbags and hats, as you can kind of see. This is also a headpiece, has a solar oscillator.
Oh, wow.
And so it was like a IKEA lamp, and this is a solar panel, react to light, and you can also oscillate the lights with this little handbag, and I can turn that on also.
Oh, wow.
So it kind of just reacts to the light that's hitting it.
Mm-hmm.
Also the speaker that it's coming out of.
Is that a suitcase?
This was a sewing machine suitcase. Yeah. I mean, basically everything that I was playing today, including the speakers where the sound is coming from, is all self-built. This here is a mixer bag, so a lot of the instruments kind of go in here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so actually this was one of my first instruments that I built, that I had this bag since many, many years. And with the instruments, I guess it kind of started with the sewing machine, and then I slowly wanted to start making everything that I play, so not using any like store-bought equipment.
Right.
Also because I'm here at my studio, so I have everything here that I can actually play everything and use everything. Everything is self-built.
Mm-hmm. One of my questions actually is, because you do take an environmental approach to how you transform not just the textiles, but obviously different artifacts that are associated with sewing, we'll say, but also you're integrating other things that address sustainability, such as solar power. And again, your creative use and reuse of what it is that you do in your practice. I want to say that the collaboration is deeply embedded in all aspects of your practice and your creative process. You know, given that it's such a significant part of your practice in relation to not just the materials and tools that you develop, but also with the other musicians and performers that you work with. I want to say that this has allowed for you to develop a community, a material community that has also come to impact the Maskerade Brigade project that you have been instrumental in developing in response to the pandemic. So maybe perhaps this is a good opportunity, you know, to switch gears for a minute, because there's a couple of things I want to talk about: your creative process and improvisation and how that has come to inform how you approach some of the innovative forms that you create, which is one form of community building. But I think just to establish the other project that you've been working on in the past year, can you introduce to our audience what this is and how this came about, and perhaps where it's evolved?
Yeah, so the Maskerade Brigade was my initial response to the first lockdown in Berlin in 2020, in March last year. And it was that kind of first week where we didn't really know what was going on. And I took all of my instruments home and said, I'm just going to hide in my room and make music. I couldn't do it because I just couldn't concentrate on doing anything purely creative, because my mind the whole time was just thinking, I need to do something to help the situation. And at the time, already a few friends started sending me these tutorials on DIY masks, and I started researching about them. And that I started looking at were these masks called HK masks that were developed in Hong Kong during the outbreak of the coronavirus in Hong Kong. So it was very like actually happening at the moment. And there was so much information on this website about also the types of fabrics to use, and in terms of filtration and So I started thinking about the mask and how to make one and kind of trying things out, and then writing to these friends being like, are you just sending me this because I can sew, or do you actually want a mask? And then they wrote back right away like, no, like I want a mask. I would be your first customer. And that's when it kind of hit me that I wanted to make the masks, but I didn't want to commercialize them. It was the thing that I wanted to do to help. Like that was the thing. Like I really actually can do something to help with my sewing machine, which is my instrument. What I found really interesting also about wearing the mask was this sense of my mask protects you, your mask protects me. So it's a symbol of solidarity. So it wasn't something that people were wearing to protect themselves. It was actually something that we could do to protect our community, to do something really together to try and get out of this mess somehow. It was the first response. Okay, I'm going to do this and I'm going to donate the masks. And I just made this one post on social media and said, hey, I'm doing this. If anybody wants a mask or wants to know how to do it or knows an organization that needs them, like get in touch with me. And I didn't think that it was also just gonna suddenly, like right away, people writing me like, hey, I want to do this. I want to help. I need masks. And I felt also in the sense that I was in a position where I felt and I still feel like the privilege position that allows me to make these masks and donate them. Thinking a lot about, my own country where I'm from, like the social inequalities in Brazil and all of this. Like I'm always thinking like, I'm so grateful that I have a roof over my head, that I can social distance, because a lot of the organizations that were getting in touch with me were, homeless shelters, refugee shelters, like that's just a place where the social distancing is like not an option. So that was how the Maskerade Brigade kind of started, as a kind of, okay, I'm going to do this to help. And then people started doing it with me, and we created this little community of other people helping, also making masks. And then I took on a little bit of a role of organizing, okay, who has fabrics they can donate and who is sewing and who needs masks, and then like putting all these people somehow in touch, and then always thinking like, how is the best way that we do like a contactless exchange. And then I was making this little elevator from my balcony and throwing things down on the street. And it was a lot of going on in action in this time where everybody was just at home, not knowing what to do, and everything was very still. Suddenly a lot of connections with also people that I didn't know that came to me because of the masks, and amazing organizations through this. And for 3 months, I literally was sewing from like 7 a.m. till like 11 o'clock at night, nonstop. I made in the first 3 months, I think close to like 3,000 masks. This is only the mask that I made. Like this is on top of like everybody else making. And there was also another big community here in Berlin that I also got connected with, that they were also making masks. So suddenly it was like a way to connect with people. It was like, who's making masks? Who is advocating for the masks? Because back in the day, it was still this huge debate whether the fabric masks worked, whether like it wasn't policy to actually wear them. It was like, still very unclear. And there was a lot of resistance to the mask. There still is a lot of resistance to the mask.
It's controversial.
It's totally controversial. And you see a lot of these anti-mask movement that are very connected with conspiracy theories and kind of the extreme right. So the mask again becomes this symbol of solidarity and of your political stance in the situation. And interestingly enough, because I was also researching with pockets before making the masks, was like suddenly I was making a pocket that was for people to put on their face. Because all of a sudden so many people were asking, I was like, I need to make something that I can sew as fast as possible, but that is really, really effective. And through all the research that I was doing, I was like, okay, the mask really needs to fit your face as tight as possible. And with this filtering idea, you can have, the 100% cotton as a woven fabric. This is the best fabric to make a fabric mask. But then if you put a non-woven in between these two layers, that it makes it more like a filtering system. that is more protective than just the fabric mask. So these people from Hong Kong, they were even saying like you should use kitchen paper because it's a non-woven. And then I was like researching into, I don't know the word in English, but in German, like fleece. It's like the
Well, felt. But I mean, there's different types of
yeah.
non-wovens. It's like a form of paper making in what they do. In my understanding of non-wovens, especially synthetics that are used for masks, they use either a form of heat to melt these fibers together so that they become this paper-like structure.
Yeah, but like in essence, it's felted and non-woven. So that's what it is. It's like
it's a fusing. Yes, that's correct.
So it was a lot of research in the Maskerade Brigade and a lot of also learn by doing because of what was happening, and then kind of community building and talking about masks and really putting this thing out there. Like this is something that we can all do to help in the situation. And then throughout this year, then you're like, okay, well then finally the masks were mandatory. I mean, here in Germany, go shopping or public transportation. And now since January this year, they don't allow the fabric masks anymore when you go shopping.
It's already controversial enough to try and get people on the tube to keep their masks on here. But the idea is that if you force people to go and wear these and buy these, when it's already extremely problematic to get people to wear a covering of some sort, in a time where there isn't necessarily the money or the ability to go out and buy these things, to be able to hack up an old blouse or whatever it is. I think it's really great that you were able to package that and bring forth that knowledge in a rather short time period.
Yeah, it was everything very quick, and it was the first time that I ever made a tutorial in my life, like a video of showing somebody how to do something, to do it. And with these surgical masks or with any mask, I think what to me was the most important message was you have to wear the mask properly or else it's not going to work. It doesn't matter if it's a surgical mask or a fabric mask. If it doesn't fit your face properly, which is what I see the most here in Germany now that people have to wear the medical mask, is that the mask is like all over the place in their face, and then you're breathing all around the mask, and then it doesn't really work. So like, how is that better than a self-made mask that's made with sometimes even more consideration than what the regulated big company thing is? Because then to me, it goes back to that, like, we were trying to do this very kind of grassroots initiative. And then once the situation then allows, then the big companies come and then they do it. And then suddenly that becomes the norm. I mean, I was doing this solely as a community action, but I do know a few designers that was the only form of income that they had, was selling masks. And then now that's completely obsolete. So just as a little tangent, I still actually, when I do have to wear one of these medical masks, I still put the fabric mask on top of it because it does make it fit my face better.
Brilliant.
I really do feel like when I wear them that like my face is quite small, so it feels like I am like the thing is all over. And so I still advocate for that, and I still do this work of talking about how to wear the mask properly, not to wear the same mask for a month, which is also the problem that people are having, because they don't have the money to buy 100, like it's a lot of money that you have to spend. So people have the same mask over. So there's still a lot, like it's still, I'm not maybe physically sewing a lot of fabric masks at the moment in Germany, but there is still a lot of work being done in the sense of getting this information and this discussion still going of how to mask.
I like that.
But yeah, we made this website and collected all of the information that I was researching and the tutorial and all of these links to papers and everything. We kind of compiled that with the help of my sister that lives in Portugal to turn it into a website. And that was really helpful because then we could make this information a little bit more international. And there was a group that sister started in Coimbra to also make the masks like based on all of this information. Then all of this also traveled to Brazil, where I have also there a large network. Like even till now, people write me and they're like, hey, I started making masks because I saw your tutorial and thank you so much, and asking questions. And then sometimes they say, oh, I decided to do this other pattern. Like, what do you think? And then there's always this kind of conversation. People write me about masks all the time now. which is not something that I ever thought that I would do in my life. It just was because of circumstance. And you see really the power of this very simple gesture, I guess, in a way that I had of like, I need to do something that is helpful in this moment and not be so self-absorbed in my own panic of what's happening, because obviously we were all in this moment of not knowing and anxiety. And to me, doing something with my hands actually is what helps me get through things. And people were like, hey, maybe you're overdoing this a little bit, because I was really, like I said, from like spending all my days, every hour of the day making the masks. And then was also this question of, are you taking care of yourself? Is everything okay? And of course, I was making sure that I was eating properly and exercising because I was sitting on the sewing machine so much. But that's what helped me actually get through those first months, was like, I have a purpose, I have something to do, and I'm doing something for my community. I'm helping. I'm not here just freaking out, feeling sorry for myself or wondering, what to do with my time. It was like, it gave me a purpose. And I thought in that time also, because I was so intensively doing it, a lot about all of the workers in the garment factory. Like that came into my head so much, just sitting there, for 10, 12 hours, sewing the same thing over and over and over and over and over again, because that's not the way that I work usually. Again, comes this notion of I was doing this because I wanted to do it. So that was also, again, my privilege situation that allowed me to do this, in contrast with the situation of a lot of women in the garment industry that are doing this because they have no other choice. And it's just awful. And this was always in the back of my mind the whole time, was this is what people in the garment industry go through every single day. It's super hard.
Production isn't easy. No.
For me, it was always this double-sided thing, because in the one hand, I say like, this was my therapy. Like this, what kept me sane was actually sewing for 12 hours a day. But the only reason this was my therapy is because I was choosing to do that.
Yes, I absolutely do. And I can relate to this. I feel like I'm the kind of person that when I am processing my emotions, it's best for me to make something. And it's through that process that I am able to develop and collect insights. So, no, that deeply resonates. And I think there's something about the transference of our emotions into something physical. We don't always have to over intellectualize. I think it's just another way of finding another avenue to communicate our emotions, and allows for us to develop deeper connections and insights around things. And I totally get that. Sewing has saved me in so many different times in my life. Comment quickly about the labor that goes into production for anyone that understands this, the transference of energy. Like, I deeply believe this, the essence of the maker comes through the making of whatever artifact that you're making, whether it's 100 of something or one of something. And when you extract so much of that essence of that person, if you overuse, if there isn't that balance of taking care of yourself or having a roof over your head, or any of those things that we women have typically associated in, we'll say, in the history of women's work, who haven't been valued. And when there's a deep imbalance, when there's that stress of not having enough food for your children, not having enough money to pay for your rent, that stress does impact the livelihood. It's difficult to develop a joyful relationship with the empowering ability that sewing, that, as you very well know, like, sewing is such an empowering act. It is such a political act that when you're stripped of that understanding of it and you are just a cog in the machine, it's heartbreaking. And when that person, when they're just part of that machine and they're not able to express themselves, there is a sickness within that.
Well, just how little value is put into this labor. I mean, that's a question that always comes up in my work. That's why also I work with post-consumer waste and question the consumption habits of just the fashion industry as a whole, how the mechanisms of the industry work where like the production is the lowest of the chain. That's the people that get worse paid and worse conditions for something that for fast fashion or for people to consume more and more and more and more. And suddenly with the mask making, it was, hey, this is something that is actually really useful and that we really need this right now. This masks that are made. Suddenly there was this value again to sewing that I found also really interesting. And I saw a lot of people learning how to sew to make a mask. And then it was, oh, this actually is a useful skill. And this actually is something that is good to know how to do and actually does help in containing the pandemic. So it became this discussion again where you were like, hey, you know, these people have been making your clothes for how many years and you never thought about this. And then suddenly, I mean, I'm happy it did come up, but it's something that I've been discussing throughout my practice so many years, and also living it in a way through the pandemic, living it in my skin, this hard work of sewing.
You made me think of something. I think it's interesting because of the conversation that we're having around the value perception and the disconnection and understanding of value in the production of clothing and the people that are involved in that, and understanding the cathartic nature to sewing as we understand it, is that you use the sewing machine as an instrument and you have found ways to reimagine other forms that have become part of your toolkit for building. You have these self-built tools that allow for you to perform. And also, I feel like you are just as much of an instrument. I guess what I'm trying to get to is that the collaborative nature of your work on the solo level is really an interesting journey. I know that you collaborate on so many different levels with other performers and musicians, and obviously the community building within that, but also within the Maskerade Brigade. But what I'm trying to understand is that through that cathartic nature that we were just discussing, it's important to understand that the role of you as an instrument in relation to the instrument that you're using to perform with. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think one of the reasons that I like to bring the sewing machine on stage and to actually sew something as a performance is also to make people think again about the people that are making their clothes, for them to see the process. Because it's become so detached, like when you go and buy a garment, you don't think about how it was made. So I really want to bring that on stage and be like, hey, this is how it's done, you know? And it's a lot of times that people are like really surprised at how fast I can sew something. And that of course comes from a lot of practice.
Yes.
You know, a half an hour, we can go from beginning to end and start with something and end with something completely different, or with these more interactive pieces where I even very silly things, like sometimes I just say, hey, does anybody have a hole in their pants that they want to fix? And a lot of the times that people do. And then that just gets done as part of the performance. And then it's also this thing that is another aspect of the practice of really making us think about repurposing things and mending things and fixing things instead of going out and buying something new. So that's maybe the other side of the performances behind all of the colors and the instruments and everything is, hey, let's fix the things that we have, and this is how it's done. It's a bit of showing what's behind, like what's been forgotten. And it's funny because also a lot of people come and they everybody has this nostalgic memory of the grandma that was sewing, or there was a sewing machine in the house, and this is such like a faraway memory that's not part of our society right now. Like not a lot of people come and say, hey, I'm also sewing, or like someone immediate in their circle of friends. It's mostly this nostalgic remembering of generations past, because everything now is just mass produced, and it's not there's no room anymore for this more crafted slow fashion. I mean, it's coming back obviously, which I'm very happy about.
Yes, there's definitely a movement, but there isn't the same kind of consciousness, I think, when it comes to what you're saying. There's deep nostalgia for our grandmothers and for other women in society that practiced.
Yeah, exactly. And it's fascinating because the sewing machine was actually the first machine to enter the home. So that was something
so true.
That
like the sewing machine was part of the material revolution. And that's what I'm trying to establish as part of this podcast, because it's not just about innovative materials. That to me is so linear and not interesting. I think a material revolution is a combination. It's interdisciplinary. It exists in processes. It exists in conversations, and it exists in how you continue to dissect and reposition our understanding, not just of our tools and our perception and how we can participate with them, but it allows for us to establish a reimagination and a really significant role that these tools continue to serve. And when something has become obsolete or exists in this world of nostalgia that we were just talking about, its raison d'etre in that regard is in the past. And there is a movement towards slow fashion and different DIY culture, which I think is very, very necessary. All of these forms of making and craft needs to be back in the hands of the people, because it's important that education's involved. But if people don't have a hand or participation in it, we cannot move forward.
Yeah, that was another thing with the DIY, do-it-yourself movement is still there and vibrant and going. But I felt like, again, with the masks was really a resurgence of this DIY culture of like, hey, you really can do this yourself. And it was a moment where you didn't find this anywhere, so you kind of had to do it yourself. So it was also the situation made us do this. And of course, then everything, like I said, then unravels and then it goes back to the big companies doing it. And that's what's really frustrating. They're even within slow fashion or green fashion, and there's like certain terms, even with sustainability as a term, then it starts losing its meaning a little bit. And then
it's problematic.
It's super problematic. That's why for me it's so important to like go on stage with a sewing machine to be like, hey, this is a sewing machine and there's a person behind the sewing machine, because that's another thing. It's the machine doesn't run on its own. Like there's always gonna have to be a person using it.
And having seen you perform, and I think I didn't mention that earlier in our conversation, you bring a voice to the visual language that is deeply connected in the history of sewing, and you bring it on the stage, and there isn't a need to verbalize anything. Again, you amplify all the things that are often undervalued and left silent in the process. It's bringing the invisible to the visible and giving it an opportunity to be experienced. You've given yourself the space to act as a vehicle for this silence. I think that's long existed in our understanding as women, but in our understanding of the history of sewing. It's pretty cool. I'm just saying, it's pretty cool. And I want to say that I found the paper that you wrote about pockets. And I think that's a perfect segue back into your performative practice and working with waste materials, because you address in that paper how you've come to understand what you were doing with that in relation to pocket making, but also in what you were doing leading up to the pandemic and how you were applying pockets to your performances, we'll say, but to the design outcomes that you were creating during the performances in collaboration with some of the people that were engaging. I'm curious though, do you think the materials, and we'll use the pockets, for example, which is a design element, how do you think it has come to inform how you approach your performances?
I work a lot in kind of, series. Something will interest me, some kind of design element or an idea, or like, for example, the pockets, something that's always kind of a little bit intrigued me, because there's so many layers of things about pockets when you think about like the history of garments in terms of gender, like all of that. So I'll start researching things like this, and then that will just go into the performance. I'll try it out. And with the pocket shows, also like this kind of funny thing, because when you think about in a kind of musical scenario, the pocket show is that's a smaller show of a bigger ensemble idea or whatever. Sometimes I'm thinking, okay, here at my studio, for example, I have everything, but when I go somewhere, I only bring a little pocket of it. So I like these kind of things that have like double meanings. It made sense in this musical way, but then it's also like a pocket can be a very utilitarian thing in clothing, which I find really interesting. And the fact that a lot of female clothing doesn't have pockets. The thing I think that bothers me the most is like these pants that have the fake pockets.
Yes.
They go all through the whole trouble of
The worst.
sewing this like fake pocket. It kind of baffles me. This was like an idea that I just put it out there in the performance, and I've been working with a lot of participations. The idea of inviting the audience in and just putting it out there and inviting the audience and saying, "Hey, who wants a pocket?" Then right away people are like, "Oh, I do," and then they start taking off their clothes and bringing them over. I think from these kind of like my own kind of research ideas, how to incorporate that into a performative work that has like participation definitely at the core of it. Maybe this is a good moment to explain what Agente Costura actually means in Portuguese, because it has this collectiveness to the names. Costura means sewing. And agente has also like double meaning, can be like an agent, would be the kind of literal
translation.
Agente Costura means we sew together. So it's like the third person plural. So it was always about doing it together. The name kind of started because people would come to me and be like, "Hey, I have this thing and can you sew it?" And then I was always answering like, "No, we sew it. We do it together because you're coming to me and we're having this conversation." Yeah, Agente Costura. And then that was my answer to people. And it's very much about that. Yeah, doing it together for sure.
You started all of this originally in Brazil.
Yeah.
Your practice is not only collaborative by nature, but the fact that you've been able to take what you do globally. You not only have traveled to perform as Agent Costura, but also you've lived in Canada, Brazil. You're currently in Berlin. I think that really also speaks to what has given you the ability to bring breadth and depth to you as an interpreter of not just the materials and processes that you work with, but it's allowed for you to use this as an educational opportunity for people to not only engage on a collective and in a community level, but it's allowed for it to naturally unfold and reveal aspects of your process. I think it's very necessary to develop the sustainable solutions when it comes to community building. And I wonder for you, because of the community building aspect is really important to me, because I think, the history of textiles has all been about building communities. And for you use methods of improvisation in your creative process. And I wonder, in what role do you think improvisation is necessary, not just in the performative act, but in the community building that you've been instrumental in developing in how you've created the forms of engagement in your performances?
I think improvisation is a lot about adaptability. I think those two words maybe to me kind of resonate and go together. And being able to improvise is being able to adapt in a way to different either situations or, of course, there's like a classic definition of improvisation in music, but I like to take that a little bit and then bring that into just regular life. I think it's one of the most important qualities that I try to bring into my life, basically. And you mentioned I've lived in a whole bunch of different places, and that was just kind of circumstance. I moved to Canada when I was 10, so it wasn't really, hey, we're going to Canada. And then moving back to Brazil 10 years later. So it was, it's a lot of being able to adapt to different cultures and different languages, and then moving to Germany, another thing. And that to me, I think being able to improvise. And I think also maybe because in Brazil, a lot of things, I don't know, I have this feeling because there, everything's just not so organized, let's say not so organized as Germany, for example,
right.
Or even Canada, that people in general just have more of the sense of we just kind of have to improvise everything, because you kind of have to learn by doing, and the structures are not really there. So you need to figure it out in a way that things work. And that was a lot of my beginning of my professional career in Brazil was this, just kind of figuring it out and finding ways to actually make things happen. And sometimes maybe just not having this kind of structure. Of course, there are a lot of structural problems, but there's also this the thing that I find also really fascinating that makes people improvise out of the need, kind of.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally get that. Totally get that. You said something which I think is really important. I guess I was trying to articulate it a little bit better in my previous question. You've been fortunate to live in these different countries, in these different environments, which ultimately they do inform your creativity. And what I want to ask you is that you're motivated by this interest to capture the sound of your materials, but also the language of the materials. So, and I know you speak several languages. So, but you've also have this other, sort of role of interpreting the language of these materials through the sounds that you capture. And I wonder, through the method of improvisation, like how does this continue to inform the relationships that you have with the materials that you work with?
I guess that's definitely from the kind of upcycling of the clothing side of it. The garment, like the original garment, always informs like how I'm gonna make something out of it. So it's coming from like I like to, and even with the instruments, I like to leave the original aspects that's still noticeable. So it's not just about using the textile as a textile and making something completely new out of it. But for example, what I'm wearing is like, you can see that this was a pair of trousers, and that there's always this kind of element that stays in the garment that you like when you look at it and you're, oh, this used to be that, but now it's this. So I think that really informs the way that I work, and not just using materials as materials, but like also acknowledging the history of them, what they were before and what they are now, and like telling this kind of story and not just erasing and just using like a part of the material as a material kind of thing.
Yes, totally makes sense, because I think what you're doing is you're not trying to completely erase and make it completely unrecognizable, because you create these audio textiles. You bring voice to not just the elements and the processes that you use, but there's evidence of it in the stitches and how you approach improvisational methods into the reconstruction of the outcomes that you create. It allows for you to innovate in ways outside of the traditional structures and our understanding of how we're supposed to utilize some of these sewing techniques and methods, and what we would imagine aesthetically should be how things need to be. You bring characteristic to the sounds that you create and the tools that you create. Is there a way that you would characteristically identify some of those sounds?
Well, I like to explore a lot of kind of indeterminate sounds. When I was writing my master's actually in Vancouver, I was researching also a lot about this kind of difference between improvisation and indeterminacy, in the sense of like the kind of classical definition of improvisation is, the tool, and then you don't have a score, but then you improvise in the moment. But like you know your instrument, like, let's say if it's a classical instrument, like all of the scales, and you're able to improvise in the scale because the scale, but it's always your own kind of informed choice of playing that improvisation in a way. And in terms of like indeterminacy, the sound that's making, I'm not actively wanting to make a sound, but the sound is there. I'm actually cutting a piece of fabric, intentionally cutting something or sewing something, and then the sounds are coming out of that, and it's not my own personal musical choice to do that. So, yeah, I like to explore that kind of area of, sometimes I don't even know, like, am I sewing, am I making music? And I don't want to make that decision. It's just the whole soundscape is coming out of these other actions that I'm doing something else, but then the sound is coming there. And so I like to explore that. And that's what I really like about all of these little solar oscillators as well, because they just react to the different lights that are happening in the space. And that is also changing the way that I'm moving. I'm doing something, like I'm moving to do something else. And then that like influences how the sound is coming. And I think, of course, there's different projects, and when sometimes there's moments where I'm definitely more focused on the musical aspect. There are other moments where I'm more focused on the sewing, but I really like this kind of in-between space in a way.
Right, of course. To be liminally positioned between the two, I'm sure it allows for you to collect insights and have reflections when you're in either of those spaces. And how I understand your practice is that it's integral to how you approach, I think, the collaborations that you involve yourself with on various levels, because I think there's nothing better than being liminally positioned between two different elements, because it does allow for you to develop an authenticity to what you are bringing forth, which brings me to my next question is that throughout this process, there are certain textile or garment that provided a specific insight that changed your approach to working with materials or has allowed for you to develop an outcome that's completely surprised you?
What I think I love the most about textiles is that it's just never ending, and there's always something that's going to interest me, and then it changes, and then I think of trajectory of how I started, and before I was doing a lot more like kind of patchwork things and like trying different materials together and seeing how they worked, and it's developed a lot into, I think a lot about zero waste, and I want to challenge myself always a little bit more. So now I'm very much thinking like, when I'm upcycling something, I want to use like 100% of that garment back into whatever form it takes differently, not throw any scrap away. A challenge for myself, like how do I take one thing, turn it into something else, but use like 100% all of it. And I've been working with denim a lot lately because you see so much of it in secondhand shops. So also this kind of challenge of, before I was really interested in these really beautiful vintage prints, and it's like, yeah, they're amazing, I love them, but slowly you don't find that so much anymore in the secondhand shops. And what do you find is like a lot of denim, a lot of jerseys, really just using the materials that are there and thinking how to remake the things that are just piling up as garbage or as this kind of post-consumer waste. But I mean, of course, I'm still a total sucker for these beautiful vintage handbags that you see, that I like love turning them into instruments. So I think that was also in the more sense of the self-built instruments. There's a lot of these kind of preconceptions of how an instrument should be built, the electronic stuff, and then so you have to have a hard case and it has to be like this and and I'm like, no, like you can put some electronic circuit on a hat, like why not, and also challenging these preconceptions of how they should be made, or like putting two things together that probably wouldn't fit together, but making them work somehow.
Yeah, but it really speaks to how you consider your materials and their raison d'etre. And it's also allowed for you to continue that sort of language building that I was trying to establish earlier in my other question, because you really have developed a language and a relationship with the materials that you perform with. And it gives them this space to perform with you. And I think the different forms and approaches that you take in your practice. So I wonder, is there any new directions or new concepts that you, or perhaps a form that you're looking to develop?
Well, I mean, of course, the pandemic made us question everything. Just before that, let's say 2019, 2018 was 2 years where I was really, really getting into this participatory performances where I would go on stage, and it was never like mandatory people have to participate, but there was always this invitation. Does anybody want a pocket? Do you guys want to come on stage and play my instruments? And then suddenly, boom, pandemic. First of all, there's no concerts. Second of all, like I can't think of when is it going to be possible again to have that scenario where everybody is touching my instruments and everybody's sharing a microphone, and like everything that I was doing before pandemic, right now, just impossible to think when that's going to be able to happen again. And then I guess because of that, then I've been kind of having these ideas of just, making these, also what I was playing a little bit today, of having these like oscillators that just are playing on their own, and I don't have to physically be there to play. So it's more the idea of like people come in a room and then the thing just kind of goes, motion sensors or sewing machines sewing by themselves. Like, so I'm kind of going in that direction a little bit, just as a bit of a reaction to what we're living in a way.
I also think about how certain things are becoming quite automated when you think about those driverless vehicles, where we're actually kind of moving as far as culturally moving forward when it comes to our relationship with technology. And I was thinking in my preparation for this interview with you, I mean, ultimately, when you look at the history of the Industrial Revolution and the embodied relationships or lack thereof when it comes to working with sewing machines and textile technology. And I mean, this kind of feeds into how you interpret the materials and tools that you work with, because there's a certain pleasure and joy that I know that you get out of doing what you do, and that brings voice and that activates what what you want to say as an artist. Because of the Industrial Revolution and forms of labor that were used in the production of textiles and clothing, the pleasure and joy that has been removed from the making has really contributed to a lot of the disconnection, and it's led to the overproduction of materials and textiles that we are currently experiencing. Your work brings forth this sense of pleasure and joy and engagement that we were missing from the conversation. And I wonder if you could actually speak to what aspect of your creative process informs the types of engagement that you are trying to create through your performances.
Well, like you mentioned, I love sewing so much. It's my favorite thing in the world. And I want everybody to get really excited about sewing and to know how to do it. So that's one of the reasons why I bring it onto the stage. So like you said, this actually can be fun because it becomes so detached from our current way, like our current society. Like when they put on a t-shirt, like they don't even think about how that was made. They don't associate that anymore with the sewing machine. And even how it's currently now produced, even the person working in the factory, like they don't make the whole shirt from the beginning to the end. They're on the sewing machine and they're just sewing a sleeve for 10 hours a day. And the next person is putting on the zipper and the next, so like the whole production line has just took the whole thing apart. I want to make people think about that again. How do you make a garment? How does it go from beginning to end? And that anybody can kind of do it. It's not the hardest thing in the world to use a sewing machine. And I also teach a lot, so that's also another part of my practice, actually just getting people to learn how to sew. A lot of people come with these preconceptions of like, oh, this is going to be really hard. And I always just say, hey, like, it takes practice. It takes a while to get it. Of course, you're not just going to be really good at anything in the world when you first do it. It's a machine. It has a way to use it. And then you can fix your clothes. Like everybody can kind of do it. I think for me, that like really informs how I perform because that's always like kind of in the back of my head. I want everybody to know how to use a sewing machine. And I learned how to sew in school in Vancouver. And I'm so grateful that I did because I don't know if things would have progressed the way they did. We have to take the sewing class in school in grade 8. And that was part of the curriculum. Everybody had to do it. And I don't think that happens anymore in the schools. In Brazil, definitely that was never a thing. Here in Germany, sometimes I hear people, they learn like hand sewing, embroidery, but I think it's so important as a skill to know how to use a sewing machine.
Absolutely. It's a game changer. When I was learning to sew in high school, I was considered weird. And this was like in the early 90s. Knowing how to sew and being interested in sewing was not part of my social culture in the area that I grew up in Canada. So what knowledge gap or misinformation do you think exists around working with waste materials, or perhaps how you approach in working in the manner that you do?
Well, I mean, I guess what I said before, this thing of people are just thinking that it's hard to use a sewing machine or that there's this kind of fear. Also, I get a lot of that from my students of cutting something wrong, or either you have no problem throwing a t-shirt in the garbage, but then you're really scared of cutting it somehow. So there's like this weird relationship with textiles that sometimes they come out as like super precious, but then at the same time, they're also just so cheap.
What I'm hearing you say is that there is this fear of failure when it comes to using this tool, but also, again, around the preciousness of the materials. They don't want to, like this fear of the cut, because when you cut something, you can't take it back, as you very well know. Once you put that incision into the cloth, yes, you can mend it, but there is going to be some form of visible scar, we'll say, that will be emblematic of that cut, right?
Actually, with the big scissors when I'm performing, really just cutting into it, and then you get the honest go like, and I tell this also to my students when I teach. I'm like, you can learn so much from the failures, like from the mistakes that you make. And this is a lot of how I learned, because I was also just kind of winging it and just experimenting and maybe, cutting things where I probably shouldn't have. And then suddenly you're like, oh, what did I do? But then this like totally new, amazing idea just comes from that mistake that I made. And like just allowing yourself to make these mistakes and allowing yourself to just try things out without being scared of failing. And if you do fail, then you have like double the I mean, that's also, again, like with this idea of just improvising on clothing. But I never went to design school. I studied visual arts. There's so many of these like traditional things about tailoring and making clothes that doesn't necessarily have to be done that way. So I think also that's another part of the idea of improvising, to bring that into dressmaking, that kind of cuts a lot of, like, breaks a lot of the patterns of how you traditionally would make a garment.
Yes.
And that's a really interesting space.
Absolutely. And having come from design, and it's not that I'm thankful for it, but I do reject a lot of it because it is very linear, very important to understand, the methods and the approaches to process. So you can go from one step to the next and allow for yourself to prevent a certain amount of failure. But I think the failure component is so important. So is the improvisational skill set that's necessary because of the constant trial and error that comes through working with materials, because every material has a different language and requires a different knowledge and approach to it. And I think there needs to be more of a experimental and reverse engineering of that knowledge, because when you think about how sewing and tailoring was developed, it was taught tacitly, and it was oral as well as visual, until it became a subject that was taught in school. And the way that it's been framed, unfortunately, there's still significant knowledge gaps in the fashion education system because it's been developed and positioned from such a linear perspective. That's why we are in the environment that we're in with fast fashion. But at the end of the day, though, I also think that the fact that you have this improvisational skill set, not just in how you approach the textiles you work with, but in also in how you work with these other artifacts, and how that's developed into different outcomes and opportunities for people to reimagine, and how we can think about what that can lead into in our own lives.
Yeah, especially also we were talking before about this the way we deal with technology and everything being automated, and like not a lot of people do things with their hands anymore. To make something with your hands is such a phenomenon in contemporary society, and I get that a lot from students also, or just from people that come to the studio, and then like you put two pieces of fabric together and you turn it into a bag, and then you're like, I made this. There's this sense of accomplishment that I find also like quite fascinating about working with your hands, and how to kind of bring that back into how we relate to the world of making is become more and more abstract somehow.
Absolutely. And I wonder, because of that, what do you ultimately want people to know about your work?
I think for me, with the performances and with the clothing I make, or with my studio space, it comes down to people thinking about the impact that the garment industry has in our environment, in the exploitation of resources, the exploitation of people. Fashion industry is the second most polluting industry in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that we need to think about, and that we need to change, like, now, and that we can all do it. We can all singularly change that, because I feel like I get a lot of this people coming and saying, oh, but there's nothing I can do, and it's the big companies doing this, or this feeling of helplessness to the situation, where maybe this is a bit naive and utopic, but I seriously believe that if we all think about these questions, and we, in our own way of living, our own way of doing things, we change how we consume, how we go about our relationship with products, with garments, then we can actually have an impact. The reason these companies produce so much is because people are buying these things. Like, it's kind of simple, if there is no demand, then there is no reason to produce so much. So I feel like a lot of my work is getting this across, even though it is not in a very overt way. It's all very much stitched into this very kind of colorful and musical and artistic practice.
Mm-hmm.
These are the words that I'm saying during the performance. Like, none of this is actually said out loud, but that's what's I want people to think about when I'm doing what I'm doing, when I'm performing on stage, when I'm cutting up clothes, or when I'm inviting people to come for workshops, or when I'm remaking garments and repurposing clothing. That's always, to me, the reason why I do my work, basically. I mean, there's a lot of really kind of heavy questions behind the motives why I do a lot of the things that I do that are very in terms of activism and political like drive that makes me do things, and questioning contemporary consumption habits and questioning the production of contemporary fashion industry. All of these things are like really heavy themes, or gender equality, but there's also this bit of like lightness and humor to what I do that I find that's also colorful, and a lot of lights and a lot of distractions, and there's like this, you don't really know where you're supposed to look kind of thing. And so I think for me, like, can do both. Like we can have fun with asking the hard questions.
I think that's really well said. And it also ties into the pleasure and joy element that I was trying to illustrate earlier, because when you create those playful moments, it does allow for relationship building, both on the individual and the collective level. And the fact that you investigate that as a solo artist and solo practice, and that connects to what you're doing currently in response to working in this solo environment in collaboration with your tools, but also in what you've done on a larger scale in the performances and in the forms of engagement that you've created previously. So I wonder, in your opinion, like, what do you think is a material revolution?
Well, I think the material revolution to me would be if we really 100% stopped producing new materials and actually tried to use up all of the materials that we have in this world.
Absolutely, because there are more materials in our environment than we have the ability to deal with. And over the next 10 years, I can't remember the statistic, but we're going to have over, I think, 10 billion pounds worth of waste textiles in our environment. We do need to find more solutions and alternative solutions to dealing with it, rather than extracting new resources and producing new materials, as well as clothing, right? One question before we get into the segment where I asked you to share a memorable textile. So what can we expect next from you, Lisa? Is there anything upcoming, aside from what you've already shared with us, that you are looking forward to doing?
I'm looking forward to being able to have people come visit me at the studio again.
Yes.
I miss that very much. Yeah, this has already been in the back of my mind for a while, and I want to teach more, and I want to teach people how to use the sewing machine, and I want to do this free of charge. So hopefully I'm going to be able to do that soon. At the moment, since we are living in this virtual world, I have been toying a little bit with the idea of doing something online. Last month, I organized Stitch and Bitch. It is a kind of gathering for people that are interested in stitching. And I mean, the term comes from the DIY culture, of course, but even prior to that, as these kind of gatherings of women getting together to do crafts and making. And it was always a kind of subversive way of getting women together. Oh, they're just going to go do their craft. But a lot of political action and a lot of social action was then masqueraded kind of behind these seemingly harmless groups of women and getting together. And a lot of the early like suffragists were also very involved in crafts, and like it goes all the way back to that. So I love the term, and I have kind of offered this as a way for us to meet online, since we can't meet in person, and to bring together whatever ideas, projects that we're working on with our hands, but also as a space to exchange and network, kind of care for each other, and a kind of a safe space to come together. This last year, we've had so little contact. In a way, this is an invitation also for being in a room together with people you don't know, which is interesting. Yeah.
In reading your paper, which I really enjoyed, you write very concisely. And again, it's just as accessible as I think your work and your creative processes. And I just want to acknowledge that, because I do think that there are pockets for the future in how you can capture that in the different methods and forms of teaching that I hope you will continue to create.
Yeah, also, thanks so much for reading the paper and for your feedback. I'm always a little bit like, with writing and
You got it. You got the skill set.
yeah, I think it's super interesting. We were also talking about pockets before and how that translated in like a musical sense, but also this idea of just making these little pockets of ideas and then on a very kind of micro scale in a way, like you make this little pocket of teaching, even if it's just this one person that's coming to my studio and learning how to sew on a button, but then they're gonna go out and they're gonna tell somebody about it. And then that in these little kind of micro pockets, if there's lots and lots of pockets, then suddenly it grows, in this kind of rhizome. Also of like the book by Sarah Corbett about how to be a craftivist
Yes.
and these very small silent acts of activism and how that can just grow and exponentially in a way, and how you can make that impact of maybe this one single thing that you do, and then it reaches one person and that person reaches 5 people and then 5 people reach 100 people and then it just kind of grows. So from these little pockets.
So well said. And on so many levels, metaphorically, philosophically, and physically, we're all connected to some form of pocket in one way or another, right? So I think there's something really strong and resonant in that. Which brings me to the sort of final segment of my interview with you today is I asked you to share a meaningful textile or garment with me. And I wonder if you could bring forth what that is.
That was super hard because I think all of my garments are meaningful.
Of course they are.
Everything that I own, I look at it and there's a story and there's a reason why I have that. That was really hard. But then I thought about the skirt that I kind of reworked so I can wear as a skirt and as a dress. And it's kind of been my little travel companion since, I don't know, 8 years or something. I got it from this friend of mine in Curitiba that runs a vintage shop, and we were collaborating a lot together when I was living there because he was always finding all of these like amazing things and a lot of the times thinking of me and showing me, being like, hey, you could do something really cool with this because the fabric's amazing, but the fit's weird. So he gave me this skirt because he was like, oh, I think you're gonna love this, and he was totally right. And every time I travel, that's the first thing that goes in my backpack is this skirt because it's just super versatile. I can wear it as a skirt, I can wear it as a dress. It's 100% cotton, which dries really fast when you wash and just really easy to care for. And now whenever I look at this garment, there's so many stories that are attached to it. It's been Asia, it's been from Brazil, moved to Germany, it's been to France, Spain, Portugal, all of these places. And it's like nice to have this little memory in this garment of all of these travels.
And I think it's great because you shared a few photos of this garment in different places and how you've interpreted. And I'm going to obviously share those with the audience with the release of this episode because I think it really does illustrate and capture what you just said. And which, it was one quick question. I didn't ask you earlier, but it wasn't necessarily one that I was thinking of. But in knowing in all of the materials that you've improvised and worked with, is there one particular textile? Is there one that you would consider yourself an expert of?
I think denim lately has been, since a few years, something that I just always keep going back to it. There's no end to what you could do with it. I love denim somehow. It's such a strong garment, and there's like such a history also to it. The workers' clothes, and then how it changed so much throughout the kind of history of garments, and it came more from this kind of like masculine workers' clothing, and how we can turn that around and turn it upside down and turn it into a jacket. And I love denim. Also, there's one fabric that I wish I had more of.
And what's that? What are you going to share with us?
It's really funny because I had this one sweater that I work in this nonprofit organization where they get a lot of fabrics donated. And one of my students came to me and then she gave me this, and it was a sweater that has a lot of Bart Simpsons on it.
Oh, that's hilarious.
And she came and she's, Lisa, I found this, you have to have this. And I was actually giving these out in a lot of the performances. That was also, who wants a Bart Simpson? And I would cut it out and then sew it onto whatever garment that people gave me. And of a whole sweater, I've given so many Bart Simpsons away.
Well, if I ever come across any, I will definitely be sending it to you. That's fantastic.
So there's some stuff that like you really only find that one piece and then never again. So
But that's also the way it is supposed to be sometimes, I think.
yeah, totally. I mean, one day I now have maybe 4 Bart Simpsons left, and then that's it, and then
They're lucky. Exactly. I was just going to say that. Well, Lisa, thank you so very much for taking the time to perform today, as well as share aspects of your process in relation to your overall practice. Because again, I think what you're doing is providing an alternate solution into how we should consider our relationship with our materials and the processes that we use with it. Because as I identified earlier, improvisation is so integral to the problem solving that we need, and we don't just need one solution to a problem. We need an interdisciplinary one, and I think your practice really pushes that envelope into the potentiality of where we can take things, and there's a freedom in that, and there's a sense of empowerment that I know that it gives you, and I know that it imparts on others.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for having me. And I think it's so great what you're doing with the podcast, and I'm happy to see what comes next.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning into this episode of The Material Revolution. We hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, comments, or perhaps you may want to suggest a topic, material innovation, or an expert that you would like to hear on an upcoming episode, please reach out to us via email at info@thematerialrevolution.com, or you can contact us through any of our social media channels. If you haven't done so already and have enjoyed this episode, please make sure you subscribe to the show via Apple Podcasts or from any platform that you're choosing to listen to this from. We would appreciate it if you could rate, review, and help us spread the word by sharing this podcast with friends. And if you would like to support this podcast further, consider visiting our Patreon page and make a pledge. You can do this by accessing the link that's located in the episode notes of this podcast, or you can visit our website or any of our social media channels where we will have that link made available. Well, that concludes our show for today. We hope that you left this episode feeling more curious about what can be done with textiles. Music for this podcast is provided by Interior Design, composed by Rob Mathrew. If you dig it and you want to hear more, please visit the link included in the show notes or visit our website for more information about his work. You can also find images from today's episode located on our website, www.thematerialrevolution.com, and other show highlights are available on our Instagram, Facebook page, and YouTube channel.